Welcome to A Nation Betrayed, where we're unmasking the hidden agenda, presented by Betrayal Project USA. From deadly protocols to coerced mandates to censorship, corruption, and cover ups, we expose the systems that profited from suffering and betrayed the American people. Today's Nation Betrayed, today's episode is a little bit different. Today, you're going to meet some of the people behind the mission. These are not your typical board members of your typical companies or typical organizations. The commitment to our mission and to the organization is deeply personal. I wish I could give you this great story of how we all met and aligned to create this amazing organization. But the truth of the matter is the path to get here, it just wasn't that pretty. The mission and this organization was born out of tragedy and loss, trauma and pain, a shared experience that we pray no other people will go through, but so many of you already have, and so many will in the future. The fact is, we're united because we're eyewitnesses to some of the most egregious crimes ever committed in this country. And we know that most of the people who are watching this are as well. An estimated 1.6 million of you. So tonight we're going to talk about something that most people don't even realize is happening. Not because it didn't happen. Not because it isn't happening right now. In this month, but it's happening because it hasn't been recognized. To this point, it hasn't been recognized, and that is what goes on beyond the ER doors. This month across the country, people will be honoring victims of crime. There will be ceremonies, speeches, memorials, all centered around an idea that victims deserve to be seen, that their stories deserve to be heard, that their lives deserve recognition. But tonight, we're going to address something that's extremely uncomfortable for many people because there is a group of victims in this country who are not being recognized at all. Families who watch their loved ones go into the hospitals expecting care, expecting protection, expecting healing. And instead, they witnessed something that was very different. And these were not isolated mistakes, not just one bad doctor, not just one bad hospital, but they were patterns. Patterns of denial of treatment, patterns of no informed consent, patterns of isolation from families, patterns of forced protocols. And when you step back and look at it from above, you look at it not just as one story, but thousands upon thousands. You have to ask the question, what do you call harm that's very predictable, even preventable, repeated, and ignored? Outside of a hospital, we would never hesitate to call that a crime. So tonight, we're going to talk about something very simple, but very powerful. Recognition of this, because justice does not begin in a courtroom. It begins when we are all willing to say and name what that something is. And what we are saying clearly and without hesitation is this: the location doesn't change the act. A hospital is not above the law. A protocol does not override human rights and human dignity. And a white coat does not remove accountability. This is why we're launching and what we're becoming part of is so important. We're not just trying to raise awareness, although we are. We're not just telling stories, although we are. We're creating a record, a historical record. We're making sure that we're saying their names and that they're not forgotten. We are recognizing the victims, even if no other institution in this country will do it. And we're taking the next step because recognition and acknowledgement leads to action. Because they may ignore a few, but they can't ignore thousands, tens of thousands. And when that happens, they can never say again, we didn't know. So tonight, this is where they begin. And I want to introduce some of our board members before we go into what some of the things that constitute a crime. So first, I want to introduce Teresa Chikowitz. Teresa is our vice president, and I want you to hear from Teresa as to why and how she got involved with Betrayal Project USA.
Yeah, absolutely, Gail. Thank you so much, and I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Really, it's really a remarkable thing to be part of the entire movement, but particularly National Crime Week that we're aligning ourselves with. But backing up a bit, my journey started actually well before COVID hit, where we were watching the news. There was a lot of news channels that were getting censored everywhere. It really started there when we started seeing what's kind of going on holistically across the United States, across the globe. There was a tide that was changing. And so at that point, I was starting to tune into alternative news networks to try to follow some, there was definitely things that were happening, across the world. So then, at that time in 2020, COVID hit. And of course, I was really skeptical. At first, it started off, where we thought it was just going to be a few days. They were keeping everybody home. We thought, okay, well, maybe we'll be getting on with things normally. But no, it really turned into something much more. It turned into really a massacre, as we came to find out. It wasn't until a year later, at the end of 2021, that I was directly really harmed, directly by this, other than just watching other people get gaslit. We were watching what was happening in New York, where they were saying, hospitals are filled, people are dying. I was watching what was happening in China. People are dying on the streets, so they're not allowed to leave their apartments. And then all of a sudden, we're finding out. Actually, I watched it's now Dr. Nicole Siratek, but it was Nurse Siratek at the time, go before a hearing, and she said, they're killing my patients. I think this was in DC or New York that she said that. And I said, oh my gosh, what is happening? What was going on? And what is she talking about? And she had mentioned a very dangerous drug during that conference, which was called remdesivir. And at that time, really, it was not blasted across the news waves. You couldn't even hear about it in local newspapers. So, but she's saying they're killing my patients, and we're saying, what in the heck is going on? What, in hospitals? And so we were very skeptical of what the general news media was putting out, initially. And so at that time, but it eventually we did contract COVID. We didn't believe in the shots that were happening. We knew we were hearing what was happening to people that were getting injected. They were dropping over. We were seeing people drop all the time. Say, hey, we're staying away from this thing. We didn't like the ingredients of the shots. So no, we're going to take our chances, because we were hearing the other side of the story, that you can actually, with high doses of vitamin C, with ivermectin, with zinc, high doses of budesonide, these kind of things, that you can actually beat it very quickly. And most countries that we're actually beating it, we're doing it quite well without heavy medications. So we knew that existed. And then 2021 came around, where people remember what they called the Delta variant. Inevitably, it reached Michigan, it reached my family, and I caught it, of course, the first in my family to contract it. Next, my mother, all of my entire family caught it. And my dad, Robert McCanowitz, was a postman from northern Michigan, really well known in the community and loved by all, especially myself, and my mother, Joanne is her name. And like I said, he really was a man of reason. He could not understand what was going on in these hospitals, but he knew to stay away from them, and he knew to stay away from the shots that they were broadcasting out. But unfortunately, he contracted COVID, and he usually, when he gets sick, we would take him in the hospitals to get hydrated, and also just to get some potassium and get zinc and vitamin C running through his veins. But unfortunately, as we expected, We thought that there was still some good hospitals out there, and I know there are still many good doctors and hospitals across the nation that still exist. But unfortunately, he had a situation where we took him in the hospital and asked for, hey, can we have some oxygen? Can we have high doses of vitamin C? Can we have potassium? That's really all we need. And we were not able to go inside with him. Immediately, against his will, he did not sign to receive remdesivir, and also he did not want to be ventilated. But sure enough, within day one, immediately they injected him with remdesivir. Multiple times throughout the day, and it took 4 days. But eventually, after morphine, he was given morphine and remdesivir. He was not allowed family to help him to understand, to make decisions on him. We were not informed of anything that was going on with his care, except after the fact that they did it. 4 days, they killed him in the hospital. In that particular hospital, they called us and said he was a very sick man. And so how did I join the movement in 2021? They killed my father, and I had no answers at that time. There was nobody. We tried speaking to everybody around us, and all of a sudden, we weren't getting the answers of, hey, they're just saying, oh, he died of COVID, sorry. And we knew that there was more to the story. And so we went online, and eventually we came in contact with all these ladies that are with me here on the call today, one by one, hearing the same exact story, pattern after pattern, almost as if a script had taken over the United States, after how many of these stories we have heard. And we put it together to say, hey, there's a bigger plan. And so after getting together with the folks of Gail Seiler, I read her story in the Epic Times. I said, holy cow, I'm not going crazy here. What happened? This actually happened. So that's how I got involved with joining forces with these ladies. And we have been pushing across the nation, across the globe, to meet people, to advocate, to get these stories, because we believe there's 1.6 million of us. So Gail, hopefully that gives it a good preface.
Yeah, thank you. And of course you interview victims, family members, eyewitnesses to crimes, as we call them. You interview them as well, and I think we can both say, yes, we hear the same thing over and over. And on our website, betrayalprojectusa.org, that's betrayalprojectusa.org, there is something called the Hospital Deadly Playbook, and it's 25 tactics of medical betrayal that we hear over and over and over in all of these stories. And then we also, of course, found that there were other types of medical betrayal, the COVID shots, and then the hospice deaths, and the brain death, and all of that. But we are tackling that too, and telling those stories. But the core of our board members is indeed the protocols, and that is what we formed on. But we are certainly aligned on the other issues. I want to take us down the path, each of us, of talking a little bit about some of these elements. Well, first I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in April, right? So we are participating in the 45th National Crime Victims Rights Week. And so why is this important? This is important because victims of medical crimes have not been acknowledged as crime victims ever. So we are pushing for that, and we want the DOJ to formally acknowledge us as crime victims, because like I said in the opener, location doesn't matter. Just because you have a white coat, before COVID and since COVID, they're prosecuted for some of these things that have been done. And so I am going to read the quote. Ronald Reagan was the one that established this crime victims, let's see, the crime victims awareness, and he basically did so because well, crime victims weren't getting the recognition, right? So um, so excuse me. So give me one second. Okay, so what he had said was when this was established. I'm just going to read this one paragraph. For too long, the victims of crime have been forgotten persons of our criminal justice system. Rarely do we give victims the help they need or the attention they deserve. Yet the protection of our citizens to guard them from becoming victims is the primary purpose of our penal laws. Thus, each new victim personally represents an instance in which our system has failed to prevent crime. Lack of concern of victims compounds that failure. We need a renewed emphasis on and an enhanced sensitivity to the rights of victims. These rights should be a central concern of those who participate in the criminal justice system. And it's time all of us paid great heed to the plight of victims. That's from President Reagan when he established National Crime Victims' Rights Week. And that's incredibly important because, as you can see from this picture here in my own story, those responsible for preventing crime did not prevent crime. This is the scene outside of my hospital room when my husband stormed the ICU to save my life. You would think that they were there to help me because I was being murdered in a hospital. It was homicide and it was intentional. I was being abused and all these horrible things that were happening. Most people know my story. If not, it's out there on betrayalprojectusa.org. Um, they were not there. They were there to help the hospital keep me there and to lure my husband out of the room to take him away so that he could not. But ultimately, the only reason we got out was because a senator came and helped us, who took that responsibility. So it's interesting how in the course of these last 6, 7 years, even maybe longer, um, that whole concept of being protected and preventing crime has waned. And so when we talk about our, the patterns that we saw in all these cases, the first one that comes to mind that aligns with criminal aspects or federal, I mean, we're talking federal, right, is the lack of informed consent. And so what we've seen is patients and families not told about risks, like with remdesivir, right, and other drugs. Consent forms, most people don't have a consent, didn't find a consent form, or they were falsified. Patient cannot sign when the patient could have, or treatments just administered even though the patient said no. And so yeah, and so let's talk about some of that. Patty and Mick, you're both nurses. Well, Patty, you're Dr. Patty now. I like to call you Dr. Patty because you've earned it. So I know you both would agree that patients have a fundamental right to bodily autonomy and informed consent. So in your experience, and I don't know who wants to go first, maybe I'll go Patty and then Mick. Old school. Mm-hmm. What did informed consent mean, and what the hell happened to informed consent?
Yeah, you touch on a really important point. People go into the hospital expecting to be taken care of. They don't expect that it's going to be well understood, so they trust when they're given information or someone says, we have to do this right now. But being informed means, you give them opportunities, you give them usually some examples of what it's going to be like, look like, sound like, or feel like, and then you let them tell you, I'm okay with that. I'm not sure. I have questions, or no, I don't want that. That's basically what a layperson expects when they go into a hospital. And so they've developed a trust over the years for going into hospitals that they're going to be safe. So when people in the hospital, nurses, doctors, techs, you name it, they start to do things with them, they just feel oftentimes that they must be doing the best thing for me. But when people are in the hospital in those types of settings and they start asking questions, or they start stating things like, well, I'm not sure if I want to do that, or no, I want to have this. During the pandemic, all bets were off. There was no informed consent. It was, we're going to do this, you need to have this done, or they just did it. And right under the noses of people that we normally had to explain risks and benefits and have them sign for, none of those things really took place. They were just done without question, and things were signed without knowing what they were signing. And a lot of times this is what happened to the families. And then, ergo, the best opportunity, when we always used to inform a family member or have a family member be a part of a family conference when making decisions for patients, the families were shut out, locked out, and threatened if they came into the hospitals. Completely changed. There was no information given.
I don't know if you just want me to jump in there. I'll just use my elbows. One of the things that I saw even prior to COVID was a shift in healthcare. I cut my teeth in patient-centered care, the holism of the patient. And part of that holism was informed consent, because you have the right to know what is or what you don't want put into your body. You need to understand the risks, the benefits. Is there a different option? And it's also about being allowed that patient to ask questions, to gather more information. But what I saw was that was ebbed away, inched away. Education became more of a, hey, this is what we're going to do, and sign the form down here. When we got into COVID, informed consent evaporated. It went away. I have seen charts where the bottom has nothing on it. There's a consent form, and on it just says patient. And I don't understand how that could be considered in a hospital setting, informed consent, how that could be considered legal. When you're talking about informed consent, my thought goes back to the duty to do no harm. That's the number one thing when you come into the hospital that you should be assured of, that there is someone there who knows that you are a precious soul and that your life matters. It doesn't matter what religion you are, what political affiliation you are. It doesn't matter what sex or gender that you. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, it was a little feedback on my end. I apologize. So I just want to say, when it comes to informed consent, I think we need to, as Americans, as just human beings, we need to know we have the right to ask those questions, but the doors were closed and the time wasn't given, and the respect, the dignity of the patient wasn't there. Because what we saw is, and what I've heard, and I've heard this from stories from New Jersey all the way to California, what I heard was people went into the hospitals, the doors shut behind them, and they were no longer given access to those who they desperately needed as advocates.
And that's our next one. And that's the one we're going to talk about next too. So I'm glad you brought that up, because so the informed consent in and of itself, like anyone acting under authority of a hospital or a license, if they knowingly bypass that right, it can rise beyond malpractice. And so when we're talking about crime in the concept of, crime victim rights awareness week, that certainly can rise to that level. If a person is subjected to medical treatment without informed consent, under authority, that absolutely under the law can violate civil rights protections, and I would include vaccination status in there, because I do think that is a battle that can be fought. But you mentioned the isolation from families and advocates, and families being denied access. And so I certainly have always said in my own case, 7 days without water hurt. It was painful. The 12 days without food wasn't that painful. The lack of water was painful. But the worst part of the whole thing, and the thing that still gives me nightmares today, was the isolation. And I've heard that from survivors where they were on the vent or whatever, or not. And the isolation and the things that they were told made them believe and feel like their family didn't care. Their family didn't want to talk to them. Donna, your husband, Sean, went into a hospital. Talk a little bit about the chaos and the isolation and, denied access and that type of thing, and how that played out.
Yeah. Well, so as Patty said earlier, people they think they're going to get informed care. This COVID era was unlike any other time. Like before, whenever we went to the doctor, we would talk about, what the ailment was, what treatments were available. Excuse me, the doctor would suggest, and explain the medication. But it wasn't like this with COVID. When Sean went into the hospital, he expected true medical care. But instead, we were on this fast track to betrayal. I cannot even explain to you the panicked feeling that I had for days and days, because it was like you were in the Matrix. Like it just wasn't reality. He just went in for oxygen. And then in 3 days, he was in the ICU.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't even able to text after the first day in ICU. He couldn't hold it up. They took his glasses. He couldn't see. So I feel like from the very beginning, excuse me, we were denied me being his patient advocate. Like I couldn't see him. The only time I could see him was once he was already in the ICU and he wasn't able to communicate. So how am I going to talk to him then? We were denied medications. Up until he went into the ICU, I really didn't know anything. The doctor would call me late at night and would say, we're taking care of him. We've got him on this mask and this and that. And I really just couldn't see him to see what he looked like and discuss how he was feeling. I was just totally cut out. So we asked for medication early on, like even in the ER. No. once we got in the ICU and things were like very serious, I revisited that. Well, not only was I told no, but I was ridiculed for it. Like, no, we're not going to give him horse medicine. We're a hospital. Like, demeaning and talking to me like I was crazy, when I knew good and well people were getting success, because by that point I had heard about, the success of these medications. So, like Mick said, in the past, you would get an explanation. You would talk about this, you talk about the benefits of medication, but I didn't get any of that. I got told, no, we don't do that. We follow the CDC guidelines. This is the only safe and effective treatment of COVID. And I was gaslit. Like, we don't see people who are vaccinated in here. We only see people who don't take the vaccine in the hospital. These people are dying.
Which tells you the power of propaganda, right? Because that was all propaganda. It wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that whole thing has to be explored. The powerful propaganda where they would say things like that, because vaccinated people were in the ERs with vaccine injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, so there's the isolation, and you mentioned they took his glasses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we hear a lot. If they don't remove the phone, they remove the glasses. My glasses, I would have to blow up the phone. Like super.
Yeah.
I couldn't see anything without my glasses, right? And so the denied access, taking the glasses, is the same as removing the communication. Not being communicated to with the doctor, you not being able to get that. When isolation prevents that advocacy, it also affects the informed decision making and the oversight. It is preventing a patient from exercising their rights just by, denying them access of their advocate. And that, to me, raises serious civil rights concerns around, even around unlawful constraint contexts in that context. So,
Gail, may I make a comment?
Yeah.
I don't want to just jump in here, but one of the things that, as you were speaking, one of the things that keeps getting echoed in my head is when people were being given the protocols. It included all of the medications, all of the narcotics. It included the remdesivir. It included the ventilation. It included, as you get into the informed consent and you start to see these patterns just to line out. One of the things that I keep going back to is that when you look at and I'm going to call it an ethical medical experiment, because we know the effects of some of these drugs were already proven to have a detrimental effect. The remdesivir, we know from clinical trials, had a greater than 53% death rate. We know that viral load did not impact it, meaning people in clinical trials with Ebola who did not have Ebola and received remdesivir died. We know about the renal failure. We know about the effects of the injections and the mRNA technology that was used there and the detrimental effects. So I keep going back to this, that when we have indications of fraud, abuse, and harm that were being done, violating laws and violating the ethical standards, that is something that I think needs to be looked at as well, and it needs to be resonated. And that's why I'm grateful that you're doing a crime victim, because you do have the elements here. We do have fraud, we do have abuse, and we do have harm.
Exactly.
And
And you can tie that together, like you and Donna were saying, just to piggyback off of what you both were saying. The not just the coerced treatments, but the denial of requested treatments. The data went both ways. If people go out to C19early.org, you'll see that they knew way back in 2020 that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and budesonide and even vitamin C, even iodine outperformed remdesivir, right, without the risks. And it gives you that risk reward analysis, what's safe, what's not, the effects. And that's over 6,000 studies out there. And I mean, and there were a good 2,000 studies when they were pushing remdesivir on people. And so not only did you have the refusal to even look at safe and effective alternatives. I can remember my husband Huckleberry asking the doctor when I was in, will budesonide hurt her? No, it won't hurt her, but I don't think it'll work. And he would say, I don't care if you don't think it'll work. If it's not going to hurt her, I want her to have it. That type of thing. And it was such a fight to get that. We had to fight the administration. We had to fight the pharmacy. When do pharmacists get to override a doctor? And so there were all these refusals and restrictions and pushes to the protocol drugs. And you're right. That is, and what makes it fraud, because people are going to be like, well, that doesn't make it fraud just because they have a preferred protocol. It does if they're pushing that protocol and denying cheaper alternatives because there's incentives. The financial incentives that are associated with those drugs, that's where it crosses the line into that fraud, right? That potential fraud. And so if care decisions that a doctor and nurse make are influenced by financial incentives rather than what's in the best interest of a patient, that absolutely raises legal and ethical questions.
Well, not only that, just to kind of chime in on that, the very critical point, and so folks understand, I've been in healthcare just about 40 years and working as a chief nursing officer for over 14 years, very well endowed with the knowledge of CMS and CMS guidelines. All before this whole COVID pandemic, we were paid, reimbursed, denied, and penalized by CMS if we didn't drive measures that demonstrated positive outcomes. And when you take care of a patient and you do the same test results and the same studies and you don't change your protocols to match improvement or declination of care or degradation of care, you're violating your own protocols, your own guidelines, and therefore CMS is in violation of itself. Example being,
it's true,
a heart failure patient or a sepsis patient. If I'm not driving improvement of lower sepsis rates, better heart failure rates, improvements in outcomes, CMS would come into our hospital and cut our funding and not pay us for the quality of care that we were delivering. Those incentives that we used to get were all paid on improving practice. With COVID, the table flipped upside down, and I personally watched before I stepped out of my leadership role that we were being paid and incentivized basically on the higher number of COVID patients, the higher number of ICU patients, the higher number of ventilators, and how many patients came in with COVID, how many patients come in that were vaccinated, how many that were not vaccinated. And they never demonstrated improvement in care. They just kept doing test after test, day, ICU day. And then when patients were sick enough, they turned the tables again and said, oh, let's make these patients comfort care because the money's going to run dry on them if they die, and change their status to comfort care because they couldn't get them out of the hospitals at the heights of the pandemic because all of the nursing homes were full.
That's right. They incentivize bad outcomes, right? Rather than, I like how you said that, and I actually wrote it down. How CMS is in violation of its own self.
I
That's
like it.
that's okay. And with the coerce with the protocols, the deadly protocols, those were most of the time either coerced or forced, and that's not well, first of all, that is a violation of liberty interests. That is a violation of your liberty, of your true informed consent, right? So if you get consent, if somebody consents, but it's through fear, intimidation, pressure, misinformation, let's just turn that back at them. It's not really true consent. If they say things like okay, on our Substack, I wrote Tammy Baker interviewed with us her sister Sandy. When she told the doctor she didn't want remdesivir, he said, well, you must want to die. You must want to die. When I
Mm,
told Dr. Ganquach that I was not vaccinated, when he asked me, I said, no, I'm not vaccinated. He said, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Seiler, you're going to die unless you take remdesivir in an event, which I did. Like, oh, you're fired, right? But that pressure to accept those drugs or ventilation and and not being allowed the safe alternatives, that's not consent. Even when somebody's wife, I've heard this many times, well, he said the doctor kept saying he's going to die and I didn't want him to die, so I agreed, because that they wear him down. If compliance to that is obtained through coercion rather than informed consent, informed choice, I think that challenges the legality of that consent,
it
plain and simple.
it absolutely does, if you think about this as far as what are being used were at the time emergency use authorization. So these weren't even drugs that, I mean, they were just under emergency use. So you have to look at, are we violating Nuremberg codes? I
Yeah,
mean, exactly.
yeah, uh, yeah. In 2020, like the
Hmm.
even even the FDA approvals though were rubber stamped, right? Because they rubber stamp approved remdesivir, and the
Hmm.
data did not support approving remdesivir. They did the same thing with the
Hmm.
shots, right? They approved something
Right.
that didn't even exist, right? It hadn't even been tested. So, I mean, and I think these three or four things that we've talked about already, I think, Teresa, I think you could probably agree. We see these in almost every story. Those elements, the isolation, informed consent, all that. It's like every story.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? The first one, though, before even we get to those others, is the first problem is that they were not able to go to their primary care doctor, number one. If we were able to get the medication and stay out of the hospitals, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today.
Mhm.
If we were able to get what we needed. But because that was denied, number one, yes, then we saw a whole host of almost every single story, the same thing. We already heard about gaslighting, we heard denied informed consent, the isolation, starvation, we heard in many of the cases.
Yeah.
And of course, the deadly drugs. We're going to hear a lot of that, a lot of those.
Yeah, great point, because the family doc that everybody's going to that they shouldn't go to anymore, that family doc that wouldn't give you ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or budesonide because he was too afraid to get a slap on the wrist, or he was too afraid to he or she was too
Mhm.
afraid to stand with the thousand doctors or so that were actually saving thousands and tens of thousands of patients. That doctor turned their patients, sometimes patients that were saw them for 20, 30 years, everybody in the family saw them, they turned their patients into victims because they would not have had to go into the hospital if they had just received the proper life's you know cheap, safe, effective treatment. And so great point on that. Another thing that I want to talk about is there's three more things. The sedation, and we hear this in the hospital cases and the hospice cases, the old ham sandwich, Haldol, Ativan, morphine, these heavy sedation. It leads to the inability, first of all, to advocate for oneself, and then they don't have the person that they need in there. But also, we've seen it. We've seen many cases, many stories, many medical records where a patient is sedated because they want to leave. They're sedated because they are asking to go to the bathroom too much. They're sedated not because they need the sedation, and they lose the ability to advocate for themselves. It also, how many times do we see in people's medical records where they have to use reversal drugs? They've overdosed them because they've given them all these fentanyl and all these other drugs, and that to me, and we saw this in the Grace Share case, where they tried to talk about medical battery and but also it's a right. Once the patient's unable to communicate, it does um, violate their rights, and it because that sedation removes all safeguards, right? So anything like anything that happened prior, any consent that happened, you'll look in people's medical records, and the doctors and nurses will note that they consented to things, but yet they were heavily sedated at the time. So if they're rendered unable to advocate, and decisions continue without clear consent, that has always raised concerns for me.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna just agreeing there. In the case of my father, and I think almost most of the cases we've heard, morphine was administered. And I remember speaking to my mom who was handling it. I'm like, is Dad in pain? We didn't believe that he wasn't feeling any pain. Why are they giving him morphine? We didn't authorize that, And when we found that out, like, what in the heck? Why are they giving him morphine? That's an end of life drug. What the heck? What are they doing? And then we found out that he really was trying to get out of his bed. He really wanted, something was wrong. Something was going on. He wanted to get out of there. He was pulling out his catheter. He was really trying to get out of there. Something was wrong. And of course, because they didn't seem to want to deal with it, they gave him morphine. To your point, they wanted to restrain him.
Yep. The same with Lupe Espinosa. Now Heidi couldn't be here to talk about her friend Lupe, who was killed in California, but you've seen. I think everybody has seen Heidi. If you know Heidi Bond, she holds up those 2 pages of sedation medications that they gave Lupe, to the point that Lupe's eyes were bleeding. She was bleeding out of her eyes, and could not, and then they of course vented her, and she was isolated, and nothing that her parents said. I mean, she was a young woman with this 15-year-old, and so that's, it's the same. Andy's dad, if you've heard, and so Lupe Espinosa's stories out there on our website, betrayalprojectusa.org. And so is Andy's dad, Gus Castanis. Andy will talk about when his father was killed, the nurse went in there with a syringe of multiple medications, injected them into the line, and then booked it out of the hospital into her car, and she literally left the state. And he died violently. Within minutes after that injection. And his father was a doctor. He was killed at the hospital he helped start. He was a naturopath doctor who helped vaccinated children who recover from their vaccine injuries, and he was killed in the hospital that he started. And so sedation is so common. Jenny's mama, right here, killed at a hospital that she, worked. She worked there. She had just retired. She worked there. They knew her. So, um, sedation is so common in these stories. I'd like to know, Patty or anybody really, if you have anything else to add on that sedation, the sedation.
Yeah, I mean, I can share that, these patients in my watch over the last 5 years, they were sedated unnecessarily in many cases, much like what you've already shared. And when you sedate a patient, they sometimes do it to slow them down because they're trying to communicate or they were trying to get out of bed. But then once you sedate them, there's absolutely no reason to restrain them the way they did. And furthermore, when you do restrain, that's another CMS violation that they allowed to go unnoticed. You have to document that you've checked their extremities and their circulation and their safety every 15 minutes. And
Right. They
remember,
don't.
we did cluster care, and that was the other code word for we can stay at the nurse's station all day. These patients were not being watched. They had IVs stretched from the patient's bedside all the way out the door of the ICU.
That's right.
So we sedated, we couldn't see what was going on. I witnessed patients that were sedated and intubated and were left alone, coded, and died because their breathing tube became dislodged while the team was down the hall taking care of another patient. People don't get to hear about those stories. And so the overuse of restraints, the over sedation and not checking guidelines, all these things were things that CMS BC COVID were violations. But during the pandemic, and perhaps they still occur because they still use remdesivir and they still over sedate, where is CMS's stand on that? And why is CMS and all the other accrediting bodies not checking these things?
And why aren't they investigating when people report it?
Yeah.
And we're going to fix that, because we're going to start a campaign to report all of that.
Can I just say one thing? When you give morphine, Ativan, Haldol, anything to slow down a patient, that is a chemical restraint. And we used to have rationales and documentation for chemical restraints as well.
Yeah.
You had to have a justification, and that was one of the things that was eroded away at the time. Before, when you had Joint Commission walk into the hospital, if you had somebody on 2 pages of medications that it caused them to become unconscious or sedated, that would be considered unnecessarily restraining the patient without documentation, right?
That's right. That is absolutely right. You have to have, like the nurses care plan. Like nurses used to have it. My husband, when he was a nurse, he always says, you had to have a care plan that didn't have anything to do with medication. That was the nurse's care plan. When somebody's agitated, maybe the first, first of all, if they had family members and advocates there, they wouldn't be agitated because there'd be somebody there to hold their hand. But where's the human touch first? Holding the hand. I've seen my husband do it many times. Holding the hand of a patient. Even that was one thing that angered him about when he stormed the ICU and the condition he found me in. Like Patty was talking about, where they they did that cluster at the nurse's station, you know, he walks in and he finds me no blankets, no naked, dirty, because they would just like look in the window at like you were an animal most of the time to take care of you. And you know, if a family member came, they'd throw a robe on you or a gown on you or whatever, but they wanted to just be able to see you. And so everybody walking down the hall could see you, even the security people. um it was that kind of thing. Like, so yeah, so that is that was, I don't know, that's gone by the by the wayside. And then now we see this, um you know, and then like Patty was talking about the comfort care part, they pressure those families into DNRs and hospice, comfort care, and that is all financial based, you know, the incentives, and they don't want to lose the money. And again, you have these families being pressured into end of life decisions with the hospital staff misrepresenting the options to them. And so they, you know, that's coercion, fraud, elder abuse, depending on, you know, I mean, you know, there's elder abuse laws. Um, End of life decisions are supposed to be informed and voluntary and free from pressure. And when those in when those decisions are influenced or misrepresented, I would challenge whether or not they can truly even be voluntary. And then on top of that, the other thing I think me and Teresa see a lot of is falsified records and misrepresentation in the records. Right? I mean,
I got a comment.
go ahead.
The documentation and falsification, I have personally witnessed nurses without stethoscopes around their neck, and
Yes.
ergo they couldn't even check a blood pressure or vitals, but yet they had documented them in the record. And
Yep.
when questioned, they admitted that they had not brought their stethoscope to work that day. So imagine how much falsification goes on.
That's right. Huckleberry questioned the doctors and the nurses who came into the room if they even oscillated my lungs, because no doctor touched me after that first day. No doctor touched me. And he said, "Where's your stethoscope? Have you listened to her lungs? How do you listen to her lungs if you can't?" And they just stood there at the end of the bed with their hands in their pockets. And they said, "Well, there's a stethoscope up there. We would use that one." He said, "Let's see you use it." And they didn't use it, but they documented every day. They documented the same with the DNR status. Documented. Patient says she's a full code, but yet my chart said DNR.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, like
That was my case with my dad too, and I think most of everybody here too. Yeah,
yeah,
I remember looking at his records months later. It took a long time to get the records, which is another flag in itself. Why is it taking months to get records? But we're like, why is he labeled DNR in these records? We never said that, you know. And yeah, so I mean, that's just a perfect example. Another point is a lot of these things happened in the middle of the night when our loved ones got, you know, something happened in the middle of the night. And so to your point about falsifying records, sometimes this stuff happened when nobody was around. Patty, no stethoscope, you know, who knows what was happening in the middle of the night when nobody was there. But suddenly, you know, we get phone calls saying, oh, he went into full code, or, you know, these different things. Like, what happened in the middle of the night?
We always say, like with me, for me, if I had not lived, we would not know what my family would not know what the truth was. But we were able to compare notes, and I was able to personally look through the records myself and say that didn't happen, that didn't happen, that didn't happen, or they've misrepresented this or that. And most of the families don't know. They can only guess because they were cut off any communication. Then you don't know if they're lying or if they're not lying, and it's kind of like they're lying. um it's crazy. And that, I've also seen altered records. So like I think it would be advantageous for people to ask for the audit trail of the records to see when they were changed. Sometimes you can bump up the billing record with the hospital records, but the thing is, they're doing away with a lot of the charting, a lot of the nurses' notes and doctors' notes. So it's really hard to get that. But medical records are legal documents, and that is where I think there's a lot of health. There's so much healthcare fraud in, and not just even with uh, these protocol cases, but just in general and
Mhm.
overall, even whether it's a surgery, ghost charting, whatever it is, there's a lot. So what they used to say, Mick, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? If it's
Right.
not
Right.
documented, it didn't happen.
That's
So
right. That's
if the
exactly right.
documentation does not reflect reality, it's an error.
Mhm.
And that should be a legal issue. And I would bet to say every single victim out there, if you look through your medical records, that right there
Hmm.
is healthcare fraud. And I think
Yeah.
we need to focus on that.
Well, if I can add the little bit that happened to me about physical therapy, anybody out there who knows anything about healthcare and um, early mobilization and physical therapy, what they do, the entire time I was in the hospital, the physical therapist would come in and look at me and say, "Oh, you're too sick to move." That's the single most worst thing you can do to someone. But then when it came time that I was like, I'm done, I'm out of here, I'm worse than when I got in, but I'm dying, so I want to get out. I told them that I needed to get discharged. The physician came in and said, well, you have to pass a physical therapy test. You tell me today where anybody has to pass a physical therapy
Right.
test. It was 4 minutes of me standing in the room. And at that point in time, I was so debilitated. After 2 minutes, I couldn't remain standing. But so I could get out of there, I asked permission. If I sit down before the 4 minutes, do I fail? Because I'm out of here. They said, oh, no, you can sit. It's just 4 minutes total. That is never anything that's ever happened in healthcare before. But that was the single most reason how I got discharged from the hospital. It's
Wow.
all made up to fit a
Yeah.
plan.
To fit a
And
plan
there,
that doesn't even make sense. So I think hopefully people kind of get an idea of why now we are going to participate in the National Crime Victims' Rights Week, and that is in April 19th to the 25th. And we're kicking off today. We're kicking off our plan today, and we're going to have many things that we need victims' families to participate in. We're about to launch an intake on our website for a memorial wall that we would like everybody to put a to we'll send out the link to put for them to put their loved one's name and photo, date of death in, and to be on our memorial wall. On the 19th, we will be posting some information about a Nation Betrayed live stream that we're going to do, where we'll be honoring the victims in many many ways, and we have a lot of activities around um, getting the things that are crimes packaged up, helping victims package it up, and we're gonna do some training on how you can report these things as crimes. We're going to have education sessions and support sessions. But to be clear, we're not saying that every single case rises to the level of being prosecuted. But what we are saying is that there are enough patterns here. Patterns are patterns. There's no office of coincidences, no office of patterns, but there is a Department of Justice. We're saying that these patterns raise questions that certainly meet the threshold for investigation. Whether that investigation happens on a criminal level or a fraud level or CMS level, definitely the threshold has been met. And so they may meet the elements of federal crimes. They certainly deserve investigation. And so, you know, the purpose of reporting crimes is not to prove, like anytime you report a crime, right? It's not to prove the case on the spot, right? It's to create a record that you've asked for, something that demands investigation. You're not trying to prove guilt. And right now, the biggest barrier to getting accountability for us is that these cases, they're not being reported at a large scale. We're going to try to change that. And so, so tonight we talked about something that I think everybody can agree here, that people are still not ready to face. Again, what happened beyond the ER door? People are still not ready to face that, and we need to change that. And it's not that they're not willing to face it because it's not real, but because it isn't and hasn't been recognized. And with our participation in National Crime Victims' Rights Week is one step towards making sure that that happened. We talked about patterns. We talked about truth. We talked about something even more important: what happens next, how we are going to move forward. Because even recognition is the start of accountability. You can't have justice until it's recognized, but it's not the end. It's really just the beginning. It's the moment where, the silence breaks and denial ends, where responsibility can't be avoided, because when everybody reports it and proves that they reported it, plausible deniability is no more. And so we want to create that situation where responsibility can no longer be avoided. And so that's what we're trying to do by participating in the National Crime Victims' Rights Week. It matters. They recognize a lot of different crime victims groups, and we are going to just add to the listen, act, advocate message. We are going to add something for them to think about, and that is, it happened in hospitals too. And so that's our plan for that. So we're going to say their names. We're going to honor the victims. We're going to get them recognized. And we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep on. We're going to act. We're going to keep on searching for accountability. And so we are asking everybody that's out there, that's a medical crime victim, to be part of something that's never been done before. Nobody's done this. Nobody has connected and pushed to be recognized in something like this. And so we need you to stand up, tell your stories on the website, put your loved one's face on the memorial that we're rolling out. Step forward. I know it's hard. I know people might pick on you. People might say something nasty to you, but it's okay. If we all stand together, it'll be okay. And we're going to teach you how to report what happened. Because if thousands, tens of thousands, let's say, I'm ambitious, if tens of thousands of voices, people come forward, we can create something that can't be ignored. An absolute historical record, a movement, a line that they can't cross again. And so they may not be able to respond to every report, and they might not act in the right way, but they can never say that they didn't know. They can never say that, and that matters because the truth needs to be documented, and if it's documented, it survives, and that will lead to accountability. So we're going to ask you tonight to stay tuned and stay connected with us in April. And and stand with us, and let's take advantage of this month to make something happen, because justice begins with recognition and it moves forward with action, and that action has to start with you. Any final thoughts from any of y'all?
Not at all. It's just, I would just, to anybody that's listening here, if you could share our stories, that's a huge help to us. Also visit our shop on our website, betrayalprojectusa.org. We have a shop out there. We have a lot of merch coming down as well. So stay tuned for that. And also a lot of things that we're going to be putting out. We have different panels with various doctors and speakers coming. So you'll be hearing a lot more about that. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned, and please share this everywhere, and get ready for participating in some action. And email us if you or follow our Substack. Because you'll get a lot of you'll get emails on everything that we're doing there. But you can email us too, and if you have questions or want to know how you can volunteer, check out the website. There's lots of stuff, lots of ways you can connect with us. And we thank you for listening, and please, share and get involved.
And Gail, just real quick, I think it's so important for people to realize we are not the mainstream media, because you're not going to hear these things on the mainstream media. They don't want to bring this stuff public.
That's
so the
right.
more people can learn and tune in and share the word of all the things that we're working on, it's only going to help them realize what's been going on out there. People want information. They want knowledge. They need to tune in and learn. There's tens of thousands and more that have stories like ours and then some. So really spread the word and start tuning into what's really been going on right under your nose, behind the mask.
Behind the mask. Thank you. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.